So welcome again. We are working our way through the text, The Profound Treasury of the Ocean of Dharma. It's going to be a long work. It's a big text. We're on Volume 1, Chapter 6. I think we're on about page 50 or so. And I think there are 500 pages in Volume 1, more or less. But it's really great stuff. For 13 years, Chögyam Trungpa would take his students away once a year, some of them, for what we called seminary. And it was a 3-month program of meditation and study. And during these seminaries, he would teach, and he divided his teachings into 2 parts, what are called Sutrayana, which is the Hinayana and the Mahayana teachings. For those of you who know it, these are the Hinayana are the so-called lesser vehicle. Yana means vehicle, and Hina means lesser, and Maha means greater, Mahayana. But really, he preferred to call the Hinayana the foundational vehicle, and the Mahayana is what comes after. And both of them precede the Vajrayana, which are the more advanced teachings and more powerful, but require a bit more experience, meditation experience, and intellectual preparation. And so he would divide the seminaries into those 2 parts, and they would be 3 months long. The transcripts of his talks were made available to the seminary participants. If you'd been to one seminary, you could have access to any of the seminary talks. But the Vajrayana transcripts were not made available to the public. You had to have been to seminary and heard Vajrayana teachings in order to and receive transmission. It's called initiation, or as a ceremony, in order to be able to get those transcripts. But before his death, he made a provision in his will that at a point in the future, those transcripts would become available to the public. And now they are, in a certain form, and that's this book. Judy Leaf, who was one of his students, edited the transcripts and digested them into 3 volumes. The first volume is the Hinayana teachings, the Hinayana talks. The second volume, Mahayana, and the third volume, Vajrayana. And they are different, very, from the transcripts, because the transcripts are his raw speech and carry much more of the flavor of his personality, but they are also much clearer than the transcripts. And also, they've been digested, meaning, sort of condensed and worked together. If you were to read all the transcripts, it takes up about 6 feet on a bookshelf. So, we're on Volume 1, and tonight we're doing Chapter 6, and you're invited to read the chapters as if you wish before this, but you don't have to. You can just come and listen to me talk about it and participate in a discussion. But it will be richer, for you if you read the transcripts. I've been reading these things for 45, 50 years now, and every time I can look at the same thing over and over again, and each time it seems like it's new, because you change, and what you absorb and hear or read, what gets into your brain, changes all the time. Chapter 6 tonight is entitled Achieving Sanity Here on Earth. I don't find that it really that title bears a lot of resemblance to the topic. He's really summarizing what's gone before in the chapters before. And by the way, I do recommend you go back and read chapters 1 through 5. Especially, I loved, personally, but this is just me, chapter 3. I thought it was really powerful, but all of them were good. So we're going to be going over some material that we did before. He starts out by emphasizing the importance of what is called prajna. Prajna is intelligence. And there is lower prajna and higher prajna and transcendent prajna. Lower prajna, everybody has. It's just simply and how smart you are. Can you do multiplication, division, algebra, read philosophy, figure out how to make a birdhouse, those kinds of things. There's all different kinds of that lower level prajna, and it could be cleverness, it could be sort of ordinary, mundane intelligence about how to make your way in the world, how to make money, how to balance your checkbook, and to the extent that your mind is clear, that kind of intelligence will be better as well. So as you calm down and clarify your mind, you become smarter in even these mundane ways. The second kind of prajna, which is sort of higher prajna. Prajna, by the way, is a Sanskrit word, and the Tibetan is sherab. And both of them mean the same thing and have the same etymology. The word jnana in prajna, it's Prajna when it's Romanized. The jnana part is the root of the word to know, and pra is an intensifier. So it's kind of super or more knowing, right? Same thing with sherab. She is the first part, and that's the root of the word to know, and rap is an intensifier. So the Tibetans just basically translated it very accurately. And prajna, we'll use the Sanskrit, in its second form, has to do more with your sense of who you are in your life. It's what leads you into a religious pursuit or a philosophical pursuit that's very genuine. You're trying to figure things out. It has to do with wanting to know who I am and what's my purpose and how do I live a good life and what's going to happen to me when I die and where did I come from and, is there a God, and all those kinds of questions that can be more or less meaningful to us as we try to orient ourselves on this planet. The third kind of transcendent knowledge, or prajna, super knowledge or very knowledge, we're not really going to deal with too much tonight, but it has to do with understanding the Dharma. And there are different levels to understanding the Dharma. And really what it has to do is to piercing through the veil of confusion. It's that quality of knowledge that we can develop through the practice of meditation, through the practice of study, that allows us to cut through a lot of the false assumptions we have been making about who we are and what the world is. There's a chant that one can do where you aspire to help all sentient beings, and what you say is that in order to help all beings dissolve temporary confusion and liberate and self-liberate in the wisdom awareness of perfectly pure original basic space, I shall cultivate the awakened mind. I cultivate my awakened mind in order to help all beings cut through temporary confusion. Temporary confusion, you see, is the fundamental mistake, and that we've talked about before and we'll talk about again, that human beings make. It's called error. And the basic error is that I and others have true existence. And by true existence, we mean that things are unitary, that Joe is ongoingly Joe, and that things are unitary means that they're just one thing, and that they are independent. That everything is independent of everything else. That's the error. Nothing is independent. Nothing is unitary. We're all made up of a gazillion, almost uncountable parts, which are constantly changing. And we don't exist forever. We're dying as we speak, I mean, none of us are the child we were when we were 6. And in fact, although if you were to look at a photograph of yourself when you were 6, you could see the child in the adult and the adult in the child, Nonetheless, there isn't a cell in your body now that was there then. Everything has changed. And so it goes in this world and in this life. Nothing endures. Everything is constantly and fundamentally changing, although there is a continuity within the change. That's why you can see the child in the adult, that continuity that goes on, but it continually is changing. It's different, but there's a similarity. So prajna, the higher prajna, the ultimate prajna, you might say, is what begins to see through this veil of error, this temporary confusion, as it says in the chant. And the word for that's the way they're choosing to translate this word Trungpa in Tibetan, which means error. And the error, the fundamental error that we make, is that I and others have this true existence, as though we live in a world of static things. We are a static thing. Others are static things, everything. When in fact, we live in a world that's constantly flexing. Not only is it flexing like the fact that, Joe and I have lost a lot of our hair. And it's all gone gray, and we've got wrinkles, and our bodies are falling apart. Not only is it changing in that way, that's sort of the over time change. And everything changes and dissolves. If you can find anything that doesn't, love to see it. Mythically and in thought, there are things like souls or Brahman, things, these conceived ideas of things which are unchanging, immutable, permanent. But find it. No one can. You can actually find it in your experience. In our experience, all we ever find is constant change. Now, that's one level of change. And the second level of change is this, that even that first level is conceptual. It's a story that we tell ourselves about what we once were and what we are today and what we will be in the future. It's a story. It's just as though you were to sit down and watch it on TV or write it on a book. But what we actually experience in the present moment is a constant flexing. Nothing stays the same. You turn your head and the world is changing. Now there's Rochelle, now there's Mike. Now there's the sound of this voice. Now there's the feeling of your bottom on the seat as I mention it. All these things are constantly arising and passing away. Thoughts in your head. And then what we are sitting in is a constant three-dimensional movie presentation of what are called, the 6 objects of knowledge. Objects of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mental objects. Those are the 6 knowables. And they are constantly arising and passing away, arising and passing away. So one of the main principles of Buddhist doctrine is the doctrine of impermanence, anitya in Sanskrit. And I always, like to tell the story that Alan Chadwick tells. Alan was a devoted student of the great Zen teacher Suzuki Roshi, who wrote a wonderful book, if you haven't read it, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind. Oh, terrific book. And if you decide to read it, talk to me. I'll give you a little help with some of the Soto Zen jargon. It's not hard, but it might throw you at first. And Alan wrote a biography of Suzuki Roshi. And in the beginning of it, in the preface or the introduction, he describes sitting around with Roshi one day and asking Roshi if he could sum up the essence of Buddhism in just a few words, figuring that Roshi wouldn't do it. And Roshi responded, "Everything changes. Everything changes." It's the core of Buddhist doctrine. And the fact that we think that things don't, or we are impervious to that change, both in the immediate moment and throughout our lives over long periods of time, is what keeps us mired in error. We think that things are permanent, ongoing, have individual existence, when in fact everything is interdependent and made up of infinite parts. So, this is the highest prajna, that it begins to attack that and see that, and that ultimately sees reality and sees a different world, the world, and begins to live in a world in which everything is changing all the time, and in which nothing has any substance of its own, and in which everything is interconnected and interdependent. So we come to this path, and we have to develop our prajna, and what it begins to do is make us smarter and more intelligent. And one of the first things that we begin to realize is that the very notion, well, we talk about, probably one of the main principles of the Buddhist path, which is it's non-theistic. There's no God. In fact, there's no beliefs. There's no equivalent of the Bible, a set of doctrine that one subscribes to. There's nothing like that. There's no Quran. There is no text that is written in letters of gold that you have to subscribe to. And in fact, a lot of the Buddhist teachings are contradictory, because the Buddha said whatever was appropriate to his audience, and later teachers did the same thing. And audiences change, and what they need to hear changes. And it produces a wide variety of different kinds of Buddhist thought appropriate to the particular listeners. So they say, metaphorically, that the Buddha spoke in 84,000 languages, 84,000 tongues, because he said whatever was appropriate to help the listeners achieve awakening. So Buddhism is non-theistic, but it's non-theistic in a way that's much more profound than that. Theism assumes that there's an external authority, someone out there to tell you how things actually are, the final arbiter of truth. And what Buddhism is saying is there is no such thing. There is no arbiter. That the final truth is simply what you experience with your open, clear intelligence, preferably, or with your confusion. And that there's no one out there to save us, no one out there to judge us. I remember reading, I used to love Kurt Vonnegut, and my favorite book of his was a book called The Sirens of Titan. And in that book, a guy on Earth takes a trip out to this planet where there's a fellow marooned in a spaceship. He's been traveling across the universe, carrying a message to the other side of the universe from the planet of Tralfamadore. And he's been traveling for some 100,000 years or something like that. And his spaceship is broken down on this planet, and he has sent messages back to the home planet asking for spare parts. The messages were things that he created on Earth, like Stonehenge, Second World War, things like this. And he's gotten a message back that the part's on its way. There were further calamities on Earth, things like this. And he's been watching all this on Earth. And when the part finally arrives, and it does arrive during the course of the novel, it's of the exact shape and material consistency as a beer can opener. That's the part he's been waiting some 5,000 or 10,000 years for on this planet. But he tells the visitor who comes to visit him that he finds that he's traveled across the universe for 100,000 years and seen many different species of life forms. And he finds that human beings are the strangest of all because they behave as though there were a gigantic eye, E-Y-E, out there watching them. And that's a very Buddhist thing to say, because Buddhism is saying there is no I out there, E-Y-E, watching us. There is no God. There is no external authority. Things are just what we see, and we have to deal with that. Trungpa Rinpoche says you can't trust someone else's blessing or magical power. All of that must go. You no longer worship your own emotionalized anything at all. You simply relate to your immediate psychological surroundings. He calls God a babysitter. That we sort of want a giant babysitter out there, setting down the rules. No, you can't do this, you can't do that, taking care of us. In the non-theistic approach, we are not dependent on any other, only on ourselves. And so our salvation, if there is any such thing, is our own. It's independent. And not only that, but the whole idea of sacredness, and there is a very strong component of sacredness in Buddhist thought, is very different than in a theistic tradition. In a theistic tradition, sacredness, what is sacred, comes from God, comes from this external authority. Whereas in the Buddhist notion of what is sacred world, it has to do with opening one's eyes, seeing the world as it is, beyond judgment of good or bad. And in that very vivid, awake perception, seeing that this world is being here, worth being here for no reason at all. That this life is fundamentally worth living for no reason at all. It's just fundamentally of value. And that is the true sacredness of Buddhism. And when you look at all these pictures, like there's Tara up there on the wall, and here's the Karmapa, and these gurus, that's what they are teaching us, is that this world is fundamentally of value. It's very, very life-affirming. So, this non-theistic teaching has 4 aspects: view, practice, action, and result. The view we've already started to cover. It has to do with 4 qualities. The view, this is how we see the world. These are called the 4 norms of Dharma in this chapter. And they are simply, the first one is impermanence, that everything is impermanent. The second one is suffering, that there is suffering everywhere. Your body falls apart, you don't get what you want, you feel lonely, all kinds of suffering, the fact that we age, that we're going to die, and you just can't get rid of it. It's there. The most fundamental suffering, this most neurotic suffering, comes from not realizing or not accepting the truth of impermanence, that we want to hold on to things, that we want things to conform to a particular picture that we have, which is very static. We imagine ourselves as being, whatever, a billionaire, or handsome, or loved, and if only I were that. When we sort of project ourselves into this static, unchanging picture, it's like a cartoon, and wish that we could be that, could meet that standard. And we suffer by virtue of not being able to do that. The third and fourth norms really have to do with realizing the truth of the path and cutting through and beginning to actually see with the eye of prajna. The third norm is the idea of egolessness, that we live in a world in which things have no true existence. It's a constant fluxing. Everything is being born and dying moment by moment. Later in the teachings, in the more advanced teachings, this will be called the doctrine of emptiness, the emptiness of true existence. It's called shunyata in Sanskrit. And the awakening into a world of this type is awakening into a world that is very, very vivid, very alive, and in which things have no substance. It's just a constant presentation, like we're in the middle of a computer screen almost. Or they liken it to a mirror. When you look in a mirror, you can't find the images, you can't hold them. They're just modulations of the glass. And in the same way, everything we see and experience in our lives in 3 dimensions here is a modulation of the space that we're in. That's why we do this meditation on space. When you bring your awareness back into the space of this room, in which phenomena arise and pass away continuously, like it's magical. Sometimes they liken it, they give you different analogies. There's one of the mirror, a magic show. They say, oh, this is like a magic show. It's like a mirage in a desert. Everything is arising and passing away and has no substance. And finally, the last norm is peace. And that has to do with really giving up the neurotic suffering, the mental suffering, and being able to rest your mind very simply and confidently, with huge confidence, in this space of the present moment. When one can do that, peace happens willy-nilly. It comes automatically. It's really, as he says later, well, I'll just read this. Everything in our everyday life, snap our fingers, hiccup, sneeze, fart, or burp, contains these 4 norms of Dharma. Everything. And what are the 4 norms again? They are impermanence, suffering, egolessness, and peace. They're all there if we open our minds to it. He says, although the first and second norms, that's impermanence and suffering, could be taught by a theistic teacher, the third and the fourth cannot. They can only be taught by a non-theistic teacher. Egolessness and peace. Because peace has to do with egolessness. It's kind of like when you begin to realize that you don't exist, then you can't get pissed off at anybody because there's no one to get pissed off. That's a funny one, huh? He says, with egolessness you realize there is no one to suffer. So nor you can't have any anger or hold a grudge towards anyone else. And then how do we, the practice, of course, is meditation. And meditation really means resting one's mind in reality. And that's what we're practicing when when I guided this meditation, that's what we're attempting to do. Every time we just see. It could be seeing thought. That's why it's really recommended, don't feel badly about having thought. Just see them, watch them. They come and they go, just like everything else. Give up the idea of trying to be thoughtless. Get rid of the shoulds and the shouldn'ts in your meditation practice. It'll be much nicer practice, much more enjoyable. And then you just relax into this open awareness of the space of the present moment. This is called vipassana meditation. And then when we use the breath going out into the space, that's kind of a shamatha element. That sort of helps us pull back, come back to the present when we are lost in dreams. And he says, when you do this kind of practice, he says the goal of theism is to reach the highest possibility of the world's best idea. Let me repeat that. The goal of theism is to reach the highest possibility of the world's best idea. In the non-theistic tradition, the fundamental sacrifice is that your particular desires, your particular style, and your particular wishes are not being bought or accepted. You're letting all that kind of very particular idiosyncratic desire and wishes go. As every time you come back and you just let it all go and you rest in this open space of awareness. This open space of awareness also has the quality of tremendous confidence. It's rock solid confidence that you don't have to do anything. Here you are. It's not even a you. Just there it is, this open space. So it's confident, and that confidence contains enormous peace. And he says you begin to discover your hollowness, your non-existence. That's a beaut. You begin to discover your own hollowness. Then the third principle, or the fourth principle, the third principle, is action. And the action, the way you act with this understanding, is that you transcend the extremes of austerity and indulgence. Indulgence is, whoopee, let's go party. The austerity is, I'm going to mortify the flesh. Neither one. You do what is commonsensical, what is demanded in the moment, what is required in the moment, what is necessary for you to live a good life and be a good person and take care of yourself and your body and the people who are within your orbit. Transcendental common sense. We take care of our whole being so that we can tread the path. And the result, finally, it's the fourth principle, is having nothing to give up. And the idea here is, you see, we feel we're giving up something. I'm going to give up thought. I'm going to give up my neurotic cravings. I'm going to give up error. But the more you practice and the more you study this, it just leaves. It leaves you. And you don't have to do it. You begin to realize that your neurosis has gone. It just departs willy-nilly. The space that you come back to again and again of this present moment, which is really, it's good mindfulness practice, coming back to this open space. And in it, there is no neurosis, there is no confusion, there's just clear awareness of this present moment. So you see, really what the path begins to become is that we begin to see the alternation between the dreams, the thoughts that we have, and then the coming back to awareness. And the awareness is without the dreams. It's clear, it's present, it's confident, and it's true. It's real. And the dreams are fictions that we get off into, and they're very powerful, and they're very seductive, and they can lead us into all kinds of things. They can lead us into tremendous hope. They can lead us into depression. They can lead us into, take us into the depths of despair. They can take us into pride, into anger, resentment, stories that we tell ourselves about how we've been wronged over and over again. And those are the dreams. And then we see them, and the instant that you see them, you're back. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to reject them. In fact, rejecting them is another dream. That's the dream of what we call spiritual materialism. Like, I'm going to get somewhere with all this. I'm going to become a better person. I'm going to become a Buddha. That's spiritual materialism. That's sort of turning the whole spiritual path into a path of self-aggrandizement, egotism. So you just see the thoughts, and in seeing them, you begin to see the difference between those terrible dreams, and they are terrible. Even when they're pleasant, they have a little hook in them. And the problem is if you love the pleasant ones, then you're going to hate the bad ones, and they will come. It's like a wheel, goes around and around. So we begin to shift our allegiance, our loyalty. We begin to want to shift our loyalty from dreaming to resting in the present moment, to resting in awake. Awake. Awake means awake from dreams. And when that happens, then we begin to really tread the path. And if you do it regularly, if you sit, and regular practice is the best. And if you can, go off, as a few people here are doing, for an extended period of time to practice, that's great. But better is a daily practice. Because little by little, it falls away. That confusion, it just departs. You think you have to get rid of it, but you don't. You do the practice and it leaves by itself. How did he put it? You begin to realize that the neurosis you had is gone. Oh, shoot. This is my doctor. And I've got to take this. I've got an operation gone bad.